Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, minister, and friend, Chino Ross, pastor and the voice of the Understanding Scripture and Truth by Chino D. Ross YouTube channel. Chino, it's good to be back and to talk all things Hobart Freeman. And today I'm a little bit excited for today because, as I've mentioned several times, I really get fascinated with the psychology of all of this. I'm one of these people that I have to know what makes things work, what makes people tick, what makes situations evolve in the way that they do. And I apply that not only to Hobart Freeman or William Branham, but just culture and society in general. You can see the way that things shift based off of its histories, which is why I'm absolutely fascinated with history too, because you watch things evolve and you watch things change, and you don't realize it at the time, but looking back in hindsight, you can see how things turned the way that they did. And here we have Hobart Freeman, the cult leader, who's telling everybody that they can't have medicine, they can't go to a doctor, and he himself is struggling with issues that are really chronic, painful issues with his own body. And it's hard not to imagine that affecting his psyche.
Yes, I think you will be interested today, John, because I do want to talk some of the psychology of Hobart Freeman for what that's worth. I think if people go back in their memory, and those who were a part of Faith Assembly for a long time, remember the early to mid 1970s. So we're talking about 10 years earlier from this time period that we are discussing right now. And even though you definitely see there the very seeds to what is going to become a big problem in the future, there was still a lot of enthusiasm at that time in Hobart's life. He had only become charismatic, that happened in 1966. So 5 to 10 years earlier, depending on whether we're talking 1970 or 1975 or 6. So he was still learning a lot of stuff. He was still excited himself, and there was a lot of enthusiasm and joy and love in the Glory Barn, in the people that were attending there. And so people today talking about evolution of things, looking back all these years later, the people who are still somewhat hesitant to criticize Dr. Freeman because they say, I remember the early days, and I remember all the good times, and we were on fire for God, and it was so exciting to go to church. We'd get there 2.5 hours early just to try to get a seat up on the main floor of the Glory Barn, or at least get close to the front of the church where they could be right there in front of the podium when Dr. Freeman was teaching. But what I think people remember, what they have good memories of, and they should, is the Christian community and fellowship that they experienced there. And I don't know that that's any different than any other church or religious group or denomination. So, for instance, if you are anti-Roman Catholic, just to give you an example, if you're anti-Roman Catholic and, you're trying to witness to your Roman Catholic relative or friend, and you're finding it difficult to get them away from their church, it's very well possible they don't even know what the priest is saying, during every mass. They're not connected to that. What are they connected to? They're connected to the Friday night fish fry. They're connected to all of the people there, and they have great connections and love and memories of that. If you're a Baptist trying to win a Pentecostal or vice versa, it's the same thing in their church. So I think that's what people are remembering. But if they will concentrate more on what was actually being said by Dr. Freeman from the pulpit, not the great feelings that they had in the church, because I'm sure that was good and real and valid. If you look at what he's saying by the end of his life, now we're into the early to mid 1980s, the people at Faith Assembly just lived in a bubble of fear. The more Hobart could press down on the people and take things away from them, the worse it got. And the people weren't recognizing that because it was too late. It's really too late. It's 1 in 100 who were sitting there processing it and being a part of it that could have recognized we've really taken a turn for the worst. One of the things that helped me was I wasn't a member at Faith Assembly, and I was in and out of contact with them. So I might go 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years, and not have any association with Faith Assembly or with Dr. Freeman's teaching. And then I would buy some tapes, or someone would give me some tapes, and I would listen to them. And it was pretty noticeable whenever you had taken a year or two vacation from hearing what he said. And I was just hearing new emphases and this meanness. This guy was just mad at everyone. He was very negative. He felt like, Chicken Little, that the world is falling apart and caving in on me. And he became just very controlling of the people. So I'm just going to read a quote from a message entitled "Our One Remedy for Healing." This was taught in the early 1980s, so a couple of years prior to Dr. Freeman's death. And at the 20-minute and 43-second mark, here's what he said. "That's what this ministry is all about, to restore apostolic faith. That's the message in a nutshell." And I'm skipping a couple of sentences. He went on to say, "You have no right," and he's hollering, "you have no right to sit in our seats, our seats, except you've sold out to the Word of God and you're willing, whatever it costs, to receive the faith message. You have no other reason for being here. We don't give you a seat. You may take one, but some have sat in those seats and then failed their trials, and they're off somewhere. I don't know where now. We didn't invite them here to fail their trial." End of quote. Our one remedy of healing. Just, telling the people those seats only belong to people that completely agree with everything I'm teaching. That's what he said in a nutshell. You have to be sold out to what I'm teaching, what I'm preaching. That's why those seats are there. And we do not provide a seat for anyone else except a complete follower of mine. Now, he casts it in, you got to be a follower of God, totally follow the Word of God. But we know what he meant by that because we saw it in the fact you could not disagree with anything he had to say. You've got to be in complete agreement with me. And if you're not, that's our seat. That belongs to us. And that seat does not belong to you.
I would agree with everything that you said, and you almost beat me to my punchline for this segment, but add to what you said, the people are indoctrinated to have a hypersensitive nature to opposing thought. So while he's saying that these pews are for you, they're not for the outsiders, along with that comes with the outsiders think differently, act differently, dress differently. It's us versus them. They want to instill that into the people's minds. So when people leave these kind of groups or they implode, what I have seen with working with ex-Branhamites and now ex-IHOP people, a variety of different people, they miss the feelings more than they do the doctrine or the cult leader. They miss the community, like you said, but it's worse because when they go try to integrate into a normal church, which does, like you said, has a healthy community and they could have many of the same things, the moment in which somebody in that community says something that they've been programmed to be against, suddenly all hell breaks loose and they just come unglued. And also with this unhealthy level of closeness, everybody's in everybody's business. So part of the reason why they come unglued is in the back of their minds, they're thinking, did somebody else see me not pounce on them for that opposing thought? Because everybody is trained to do that. They want to pounce on people. And after a person leaves one of these groups, it's very difficult not to pounce on people. You can look at the comment feeds on my videos and you can see this. That's just unfortunately how it is. But they people were manipulated, myself included, and it makes it very difficult to reestablish yourself into another community. And I'll say it like this: it takes a lot of work, and it is very much worth the work if you can do it.
Yeah, a lot of patience for those outside trying to work with people, a lot of love, a lot of tolerance. And for those who are part of it and now out of it, just remember where you were at one time. We played a clip, I don't know, John, it's been a few segments ago, where he was coming down really hard. We know what his belief was against medicine and medical science for anyone in the church to go to a doctor. It doesn't matter whether need a tooth filled or you've got a broken bone. But he took it to a new extreme by saying you can't even provide medicine for other people. And then he talks about sick and elderly parents and relatives. He said basically, and we played the quote, if they need medicine, you need to send them on to the nursing home. Because if you bring them into your home and provide, you're not taking medicine yourself, but you're providing that for them, then you're just opening doors for them to be demon possessed through the names of the demons behind the names of all the drugs. So we played that clip, and that's bizarre enough, but I would like for people just to continue to hear, this isn't our opinion about Dr. Freeman. This is what he actually said, believed, taught himself. So he had a series, which I nicknamed Psychobabble, because it was just the craziest stuff. And Hobart did not have any advanced training to qualify him to talk in these areas, but it was his series, so-called, of deeper discernment and deliverance. And he had all kinds of messages in this that are so bizarre and make no use of scripture at all. And he had one entitled Discerning and Dealing with Multiple Personalities, Part 1 and Part 2.
Well, I'll tell you, friends, God is giving you a lot of long-suffering time to deal with the question of whether or not you're going to make the right decision about that garbage dump that you've got in your house. Some of you are just not going to deal with it until maybe you lose a baby or a husband or a wife or something. Now, it's not serious. That isn't the only evidence of that. There are others that have noticed the connection between problems and television and so forth. That isn't the only evidence of that. There are others that have noticed the connection between problems and television and so forth. I don't like to say that maybe some of you suffered some losses because you've not heeded the warning. You see, it's not a thing we can do. We don't stand at the door and say, do you have a television? Do you wear pants at home? Well, we could ask either male or female that one. Do you wear the pants at home? Do you watch television? Do you speak in tongues every day? And on and on. We don't ask questions like that. We just have some basic areas of unity. But you see, one day God may just quit fooling with some people. Time will run out. And you'll have to lose a child before you wake up. Maybe you already have. I'm not saying, I'm just saying think about it, because that's what the Lord showed here. And those who've gotten rid of that trashy vision have had good testimonies, about it changes things and they feel clean inside and so forth. Now, I don't like to say this like sarcasm, but I couldn't care less what somebody might think about. Faith Assembly doesn't believe in having a television. Well, I'll tell you something else. We don't believe in smoking and social drinking and going to Hollywood movies and a lot of other things, but we don't have any rules on the wall that we check you out before you come in. We just assume if you mean business with God.
So, as we hear through that, not only is it wrong, not only are they trying to trace their problems back to taking some medicine, but what he just said here, because they had a big rule against watching or owning a television set, he had nicknamed it Trashy Vision from TV and railed against it all the time. And if again, if I could just remind people of the fact, if you will go back 10 years earlier, Hobart owned a television set because he talked about different, in a message, he would talk about something he had just seen on TV the night before, or that as he was eating lunch, he and June, his wife, were listening to a radio program. He was a member of a shortwave amateur radio club. But later in life, he outlawed all these things and never told people the reason that he was sinning earlier in his life by having a television. He always pretended like, I've always believed this way. This has always been true of me. He always acted as though I don't have anything and never have had anything wrong in my life. But actually, he owned a television set. But he said here, some of you are just not going to deal with it until you lose a baby. And he says, or a spouse, a husband or wife. He says, now it's just that serious. We don't stand at the door and say, do you have a television? Do you wear pants at home? Remember, he's outlawed women to wear pants, and he wants to make sure they're not sneaking behind his back and wearing pants at home, as though he has any jurisdiction in their home and in their home life. But oh my word, haven't we seen that he wanted to be behind your closed bedroom doors? He wanted to be in how you raise your children. He wanted to be involved in everything. So he said, now we don't stand at the door and say, do you have a television? Do you wear pants at home? But one day God may just quit fooling with some people. Time will run out and you'll have to lose a child. Faith Assembly, here's a quote, doesn't believe in having a television, but we don't have any rules on the wall. I mean, I hate to say this about Freeman, but in those instances, he is just, he's almost an idiot, because anybody can hear when you say, and I hate to call anybody an idiot, that's really demeaning to say that, but when you say in one sentence, Faith Assembly has this policy and we do not believe in television, then you say, but we don't have a rule on the wall. In other words, don't blame us for the legalism. It's just all psychobabble to say, I don't believe in this and this is wrong and it's contrary to God's word, but we don't have any rules on that. Every time he got to dress, he would say, now we're going to talk about the Christian way to dress, but we don't have any rules or laws here at Faith Assembly. And then he would go right on and legislate a half a dozen of them. And I don't know what else to say. I probably shouldn't use the word idiot. Maybe you can help me and give me a better word, John.
Well, I've come to the point in my life where I no longer call Freeman or Branham or any of these guys idiots, but I will say that they had constipation of the brain and diarrhea of the mouth. And I think that's about the nicest way I can put what these guys had. But, the double speak is something that I noticed early in my leaving the message cult, but I didn't know how to frame it in my head, because Branham did the same thing, and I'm certain if you study all of the latter rain people who turned out to be cult leaders, they all kind of went down the same route, where it was how do I say it? In the old Bonanza show, the Indian would come up and he would say, "White man speak with forked tongue," and what he's saying is he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, and that's what these guys were doing. They're experts at it. And it wasn't until I'm fascinated with documentaries, and I'm studying many different psychopaths, and I realize how their brains work, the way that they think. You can see, anybody who's watching these documentaries can see it. And they all kind of do the same thing. They'll say one thing, but their brain, there's something wrong in their head where the left and right halves aren't working correctly together. And they'll say one thing, and then they'll immediately just say the opposite thing. And you don't know which pathway to go, right, in your mind. And it throws people off balance. And in reading Dr. Stephen Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, that is one of the key manipulation tools for brainwashing. If you can throw their mind off balance, then everything you say thereafter, they're still thinking, trying to wrap their brain on, well, which direction do I take? And you're planting whatever you want in their head right after that. And it's a mind control technique. I can't say that these guys studied mind control and they learned this, but I can say that they're all doing it. And you can go study Freeman, you can study Branham's tapes, you can study a lot of these guys, and you can see this happening.
Yeah, that's for sure. And as you say, the people are confused after they hear that statement. I think some of us that think and reason more logically, when I would hear a statement like that, it doesn't compute in my mind. Something has to give. Either you have a law or you don't have a law. It can't be both. And Hobart was real good at saying it both ways. Now, this is an absolute law. Faith Assembly does not believe in television sets. And then he'd say, but we don't have any rules on the wall. And I would go, well, that is your rule. And it's definitely on the wall. It may be invisible, but it's definitely nailed right to the wall. And everybody knows that it's nailed to the wall, even if it's invisible, because you just said it with your mouth. And yet for people that don't seem to think reasonably, they would leave that place, because I had discussions with them, John, and they would say, oh, no, we don't believe in televisions, but we don't have any laws. Dr. Freeman didn't set any laws. And I would say, how can you say that? But, they just weren't paying attention that what he had said was definitely contradictory. And what's happening at the end of this time period in Freeman's life and ministry, with him now prohibiting you even working in a medical supply field, like making in a company that makes rubber gloves that may be used in a medical facility. What I called, they were just living in a wilderness of mirrors. And what I mean by that is there were so many mirrors around them that they were directed to look into to see if you can see what the problem is, why you don't have your healing, why your loved ones aren't saved, why you don't drive the new car yet, why your husband hasn't gotten promoted, why the wife is still barren, whatever it is you have claimed by faith. You look in this mirror and then it directs you over here, and then you look over here and there's another mirror. Oh, it wasn't because of that. It was, and then now you look over here. It's just a wilderness of mirrors trying to figure out why Hobart was still having a heart attack during couple of his sermons. He was actually under a heart attack, why his polio short leg never grew out, why his vision got worse and he couldn't read and had a giant print Bible. Why don't we have these things? Rather than saying maybe our theology is deficient, maybe there's something wrong in the way we have gone about reading and interpreting Scripture. Maybe our hermeneutical system needs some work. Rather than do that, they wander out into this wilderness of mirrors, just looking around, trying desperately to figure out what stone is still left unturned. And if I could just turn over the right stone, then all of a sudden my healing will be manifested, or my loved one would be saved, or this would happen. And so in this series of deeper discernment and deliverance, this is deeper. This is deeper than the average Christian gets to have. This is deeper. This is a path he began to go down. And I, as you know, John, have all of Hobart Freeman's notes. And at the end of his life, he would, and I have given you this if you want to put that up. He would type up his notes. They're in a very abbreviated form, and I've read enough of them that I know exactly, and you can tell they're not difficult to understand what his abbreviations stand for. But here he has something called Closing Doors Opened Through Heredity. And I'm just going to read some of this, and if you put it on the screen, people can study it for themselves. And I'm not going to read all of it, but just to show you how desperate they were in this wilderness of mirrors to find what is going wrong in our life. He says every Christian who takes deeper deliverance seriously needs to consider such a possibility. It may explain why some things are not yet free. And then he says parents, grandparents, relatives, Remember, he's talking about heredity. Maybe they were involved. These are his actual notes. If you find the messages in Deeper Deliverance and Discernment and just listen through them, you will find where this is exactly what he does. He uses this and he preaches from that. And it's so strange that people thought that he's speaking under some, immediate direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And I've said before, he has all of his jokes, all of his stories. And I'm not saying that's wrong. You need to probably have some notes to teach from rather than just teach from an empty head. But he's pretending like this is all coming directly from the Lord, and it's not. It's coming from his notes. So he said, you need to investigate your parents, your grandparents, your relatives. They might have been involved in the occult, adultery, false religion. And he has an example, JW, and that, of course, is Jehovah's Witnesses. And remember, you're not supposed to use abbreviations, according to Hobart. He outlawed abbreviations earlier, but he always used them. Criminal acts, rape, infidelity. He says parents RC. That means parents in the Roman Catholic Church. And then he goes on in the next heading to talk about parents RC. So he said, maybe you were delivered in a Roman Catholic hospital. He said, those are temples of demons because they have religious error in them. Baptist denominations and Methodists, they have, Baptist church and our Baptist hospital and Methodist hospital. And Roman Catholics have hospitals as well. So if you are born into a denominational, not church, hospital, you might have picked up a demon there. If you were baptized as an infant into a false religion, your mind is saturated with religious error in Catholic schools. You need to break such connection and renounce the strong spirits. Simply leaving Roman Catholicism is not enough. You have to go through deeper deliverance to set yourself free. Talks about confirmation rites. Then he talks about, because he's been talking about your parents, the heredity involved in your family. Maybe your parents were involved in fornication or adultery. Maybe they were, but what does that have to do with me? Well, according to Hobart, you inherit demons of fornication and adultery through your parents or through your grandparents. Yeah, this is Hobart Freeman Faith Assembly Bible teaching. This is what you go to church to learn. He said, maybe you're illegitimate. Either you're illegitimate or your brother or sister is illegitimate. So what people had to go do, they had to go ask their mom and dad, was I born within or without wedlock? Pops, I need to know. How is, when and where and with whom and under what conditions was I conceived? Fornication, adultery, prostitution. Maybe your mother was a prostitute and she got pregnant as a prostitute. So he said, if you know any of these things are true, then you could pick up a spirit of lust or fornication or adultery can pass to the child at birth. So if you later in your life battle lust or fornication or unclean thoughts, then you need to break the hereditary bondages. And then he talks about a girl who has problems with lust. Then maybe her mother was a fornicator, or maybe she was an illegitimate child before her birth. All of this is in his notes. I'm not making any of this up. And it just goes on and on and on. There's something seriously wrong here. There's something really bad.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. One of the studies that I've been doing, as you know, I've been digging into the Jesus movement and how the shepherding movement was involved in the Jesus movement. And, you know, according to the timeline, you've got many of the shepherding guys were, operating at the same time as Hobart Freeman. So there's a little bit of cross-pollination there. And one of the ideas that emerged from all of this latter rain mess was the idea of generational curses. And what you're describing, was your mother a prostitute, was all of this nonsense was based off of this generational curse idea. And Branham also taught the same thing, but he very insidiously tied it to racist doctrines. He produced this serpent seed doctrine, which was essentially the doctrine that Eve mated with the serpent, and they produced Cain, and Cain's offspring were all evil. But he carefully omitted the words black and Jew from his doctrine, and then later followed up with the hybriding doctrine. And in the hybriding doctrine, you cannot mix a black race with a white race, and if you did, it created a generational curse. And Branham pulled the old law from, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, talking about the 14 generations. You can't enter into the congregation. Well, he implied and suggested that for 14 generations, you're doomed to hell. You had this generational curse. And this stuck. I don't know why these guys picked it up, but it stuck. And it is one of the real barriers to escaping, because in the back of your mind, you're thinking that this whole world is filled with demons, and you might have accidentally caught one of them.
Yeah, and some of this, John, does go back, obviously, to Bible verses. You know, no cult has ever been started on anything but a Bible verse, where I think even with the 10 Commandments, God said he'll visit the iniquity, the third and fourth generation of, that parent. But you got to take the whole, there's a better way to interpret that, because you have to take the whole of Revelation. If you go over to Ezekiel's prophecy, Ezekiel clearly says the son will not die for the father, or the father for the son, but everyone will die for their own sin. Ezekiel very clearly says that. So what is Moses saying well, that's a whole theological issue, but I don't think that there's any such thing as a generational curse. I definitely believe God deals with people individually. However, let's say that your grandfather was a notorious bank robber and your father was a notorious bank robber. You're going to probably have some of the consequences around you in your life because of what your relatives have done. It doesn't mean you're being punished because of them. It just means that there can be some residual effects happening, and that's not a curse that's put on you. That's just the way that it is. And that's a whole story in itself, but there are better ways to interpret that passage, I would say, just like there are better ways to interpret the woman with the issue of blood over in Mark's gospel that we've talked about earlier. So here by the end of Hobart's life, he's just not a pleasant person to talk to at all. He's cranky. He doesn't feel well. He's got pressures from within and from without. I did not visit Faith Assembly often. I was busy in my own ministry. I was leading a group of people up in Minnesota for a few years, and then in New England for a few years after that, during which time Hobart was still alive. But I did make some occasional trips to Faith Assembly here on, this is Dr. Freeman's tape list, 1,157 of them, all of them. And if you see up here in this corner, it was published the month after he died. So this was like his final tape list. And I have it marked up, and I know when I was there because I have the very messages marked when I was there. And I was not there that often, but occasionally I would visit, and I would try to go up and talk to Dr. Freeman afterwards. And, he did not want to talk. I can remember going up one time, and I don't even think I got to him. There was always at least a little line. There wasn't a very long line because people were too afraid. He had scolded everyone and said, you shouldn't need counseling from me because I've already taught you the word, go put it into practice for yourself. So there was generally not a very long line by the end of his life. But I can remember a time when I was in line and John Abel was up there. Now, John, I've mentioned John before, he was the tape guy. He went way back early in Faith Ministries days. Bruce Kinsey was the one who was responsible right after he got saved for handling Dr. Freeman's tapes and books. But the ministry was just growing and getting bigger and bigger. And so John Abel was hired full time to be the man who did that. And to start with, he did it by himself. And I can remember John being up there, and I remember watching Hobart holler at him. I mean, raise his voice and yell at him. And I wished I could remember exactly the conversation. I don't, so I won't make believe, but it had something to do with, this person shouldn't be over here. Get this person over there. I just know that he was very upset and he was hollering. And I had never seen that before. I'm not, and I know all of us, all ministers are human beings, but you would think that that if you're going to yell, you're going to save it for home. You're not going to do it in public where everybody else can see you. But I mean, he was really mad and yelling at John Abel that John needed to do something differently. And I have mentioned before, whenever Hobart was in court in Warsaw, and he got separated from the people that were there with him, and he got surrounded by some newspaper reporters. I said, because the newspaper reporters reported this, they said he hollered, "Where are my helpers?" Because they had wandered off somewhere. Where's my entourage? And I guess victims of abuse just get used to bad treatment. That's just the way that it is, and that's why they don't recognize Hobart's shortness and his meanness. They just probably don't recognize it, because if you're the dog that's kicked all the time, you're just happy to get a crumb, or you're happy if your master ever speaks to you or smiles at you, because most of the time he's going to kick you and you say, "It's no big deal. I'm used to that." And so those occasional times when he smiles at the dog or the person is just a wonderful experience for you. But that's the nature of abuse. People in abused relationships get used to it. We just see it over and over, and they say it's no big deal. For those of us on the outside, I think it is a big deal. And maybe they would say, "Well, look, Chino, you're being so unfair. Hobart's got a church of 2,000 or 2,300 people. He can't talk to every person and be patient with every person." But I would go back to the very beginning, and I've mentioned this before, on his very first tape in his series on the book of Acts, which is entitled "The Need for Empowering." They had a couple of hundred people there, and he said, "This is plenty big enough." He said, "If we ever get bigger, we're just going to split the church and divide." Well, they grew and grew and grew, and he wasn't about to give up his following. So my point is, I think that's the problem of having a church with 2,000 people. You cannot be the pastor. You can't be the shepherd. You don't know those sheep. It's interesting when you look in the pages of what was happening in the Reformation in Switzerland, in Germany, in the early 16th century, at the start of the Reformation. You had so many people who were leaving the Roman Catholic Church, who were becoming truly born again. And there was a need for churches to spring up everywhere. And I know in Geneva, they had a policy in Geneva, Switzerland. And I've always thought back on this and thought this was very wise. There were some wise men behind the Reformed efforts happening in Europe at that time, where they said that we're going to have a maximum of 50 adults per group, and that's it. And once you've got 50 and then you've got children, that's enough. We'll start another group and we'll have to have another pastor. And Hobart was never willing to follow that. Even though Hobart talked all the time, one of his favorite subjects was God is in the process of restoring the New Testament pattern of the church, the fivefold ministry: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. God is into body ministry and restoring the New Testament pattern. But as I've said all the time, they only had a one-fold ministry at Faith Assembly, and it was a whole gaggle of teachers. And Hobart wouldn't let those guys leave. If you're restoring the New Testament pattern of the church, shouldn't those men be going out and becoming pastors of these different local groups? Hobart wouldn't allow that to happen. He said, this is your church, you ministers, and when I'm teaching, you need to be here, because he's the voice of authority. He's the voice of God. And consequently, those ministers were not allowed to go out and travel around and stay in these other places. They could travel around, they just couldn't stay there. So I look at this and I hear the stories that people have told me, that people who were actually a member of Faith Assembly. For instance, there's this one brother who was there all the time, sat on one of the front rows. And because I received criticism, and some of it is probably deserved, I received criticism in these podcasts because I was not a member of Faith Assembly and I was not there for every service. And there's some validity to that, although I don't think there's much validity to it, but there is some. I wasn't there. They say, Chino, you weren't there. You're just talking from a distance. So I have talked to people that were there, and then some of the stories I hear make me really glad that I wasn't there. And this one brother said, Chino, yeah, Hobart was not approachable at all. He said, I know, I sat on the second or third row and I would watch the way he would deal with people. He did not want to have to deal with people. Hobart wanted to stay at home all week, be chauffeured there, sneak in the back garage door, sneak in his back office door, sit in his office and pray and listen to the worship. When he's ready, he opens a door right behind the pulpit, goes out, preaches, and I promise you, he wanted to go back through that door and go back home. He felt like my teaching is my teaching. He was not a pastor. He just a lecturer. I don't care about all these people. Any care that I have is expressed through my teaching you the word, and you go out and live it yourself. He was really wanted to be a monk and just live by himself. But Faith Assembly would occasionally have what they call love feast, potluck. It's a big church fellowship meal and time together. And so everyone would bring food and the whole church would participate. And, what other churches would call, a potluck or, just a fellowship meal, they called a love feast. And they would have those periodically there. And so this brother said, but you know what? During the love feast, we know during the ones in the Bible, things like foot washing happened. And we know who went out and washed the people's feet. It was Jesus. He got down on his hands and his knees and he washed the feet of his own apostles. It was just amazing that our Lord was of such a character and personality that he would do that. But that's what leaders do. Their number one calling is servanthood. That's their number one calling, is to be a servant. And that's exactly what the Lord was. So during their love feast, Hobart would stay up on the platform, never got down off the platform to mingle with these hundreds of people and these scores of wonderful Christian families out there. And people will say, well, he couldn't, it was too big. That's his own problem. The church never should have gotten that big. He sinned against his own Book of Acts teaching. But anyway, even with that big group, you could still go and fellowship with somebody, somewhere, a few of them. He would stay up on the podium. June would be up there with him. Normally the Kinseys, the Hills, two sons-in-law and their families would be up there. But here was what was so fascinating to me. There was somebody else up there with him. And this brother telling me the story said, he said, we had more than one, but there was one particular person in the church who was very mentally handicapped. And said Brother Freeman would always invite him to come up there on the podium and have their meal with the Freemans, with the hierarchy up there on the platform, up on the platform. And, when I heard that, I'm sorry, but here's the direction my mind goes in. The only person, it's a good show. Like, look how humble and thoughtful and compassionate I am as your pastor, that I will have this mentally handicapped person up here with me. But the mentally handicapped person couldn't raise any objections or problems or questions to the teaching. In other words, he didn't present any kind of threat or obstacle to Dr. Freeman. So on the one hand, it was a good show that you were such a compassionate person that you would have a mentally handicapped person up there. But on the other hand, I think there were probably some selfish motives involved. Why not have me up there or somebody else up there to hang out? It probably would not have worked very well. So I don't know, John, when I wasn't at Faith Assembly, but had I been there and had I witnessed that, I think I would have had the same problems then that I have now when I hear the story.
I wasn't there either, but I don't know that I could put myself in a place where I would disagree with what you said, because even in the Branham sects and Branham Tabernacle, you didn't find some of the elite figures lowering themselves and humbling themselves to be with the lowly people, and it's a common problem. Back to something else that you were talking about, Stockholm Syndrome, basically, where you make this connection to the leader. That's part of the psychology behind this. If they're above you, if they don't lower themselves and humble themselves to be like you, well, they can hold you captive in the mind. And I'll never forget when I read Dr. Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control. Recommend it for anybody who's listening if you haven't read it. It does help you. I'll never forget when I came across his mentioning of Stockholm Syndrome, and my first thought was, no way. I don't agree. There's no way. We weren't trapped. We weren't in a prison. We weren't locked in somebody's basement by a captor. We could have left at any time. But as you keep reading and you understand that your mind is doing mentally what Stockholm Syndrome victims do physically, as soon as you grasp that, it suddenly clicks and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they did this to my head. And you go through this phase where you get really angry about it. And I've went through all of the stages of grief over this, and I think many of the people who have been in the support groups I've worked with have. You go through the grief because you feel this broad sense of emotion. You're connected to the cult leader. The cult leader was better than you. They didn't stoop themselves down to be at your level. Yet at the same time, they really destroyed lives. And I think that's the hardest part to grasp, because as you're connecting to the leader, myself included, you feel this empathy for them. You feel sad and sorry for them once you get into the final stages of grief, because they too can't really help what they did. Their mind is just so messed up that they can't help it. And I still wrestle with that today. Was it all on purpose? Was the person just mentally insane? How did all of this evolve? And I think some of those questions will just simply never be answered.
Yeah, and those are never the paths I have gone down. I think, John, you've gone down more of those from the psychology side. Most of the paths I've gone down have been theological or biblical. I'm just interested in what was he teaching and where was he right and where was he wrong. But you are so right. As you get into the fallout of groups like Faith Assembly and Faith Assembly itself, the damage is so deep and so long lasting. And you still hear from people, and I still hear from people to this day who have been traumatized by it, for better or for worse. Some people have dealt with it far better than others. Unfortunately, some people have not been able to deal with it at all and have just turned their back on Christianity and the Bible. And that's just a terrible thing to have had happen. But when I look at Dr. Freeman, if anyone needs, even to this day, because we still have IHOP, all of the apostles and prophets and wacko groups around us today, if anyone needs any reason a reason not to follow a man or to sit under his ministry or to listen to his teachings, look for narcissism. That's a reason. I don't care really how accurate their teaching even is, or how qualified or how trained they are. Narcissism, which is like the whole tenet of Dr. Freeman's life and ministry, he constantly talks about himself. I've never heard anyone, and I've listened to a lot of teachers and a lot of preachers, and I've never heard anyone talk about themselves more than him. And it's so repetitive. It's not new stories. It's the same stories that are locked in his mind. And he tells them over and over again. And when I sit there and listen, I've got 1,157 Hobart Freeman messages. And so as you listen to that, that covers a 18-year period of time from 1966 to 1984. And once I got beyond dealing with the theological and biblical stuff, because I thought he is totally in error about serious matters, then you have time or the luxury to listen to other things and to look for other things. And so then I began to see, you know what? In 1,157 messages, I've never heard a single happy story from childhood. Not a single one. I've taught over 2,000 messages that are available. I bet if you heard all those, you're going to hear a lot of stories from my life, but they're just told one time because it comes to your mind in connection to some message, but it's a happy story from childhood. I happen to have a very happy childhood. Not everybody did, and I'm sorry if they don't. And, you don't get to control what kind of home life you were born into or what kind of childhood you had, what kind of parents you had. I had wonderful parents, and maybe Hobart did not feel that he had that. But it is striking to me that in over 1,000 messages, I've never heard a single happy story from childhood. Now, I've heard a couple of stories, but they're about sicknesses and illnesses and accidents that he had. Never heard a happy story of riding a bike, of playing ball, of swimming down at the quarry, of going with mom and dad. Hobart was born a long time ago, so going to the dime store and getting to spend a penny on a piece of chewing gum. Not a single happy story from his childhood. Not a single story about his father, whose name was Edward. That's where Hobart got his middle name, Hobart Edward Freeman. His father's name was Edward. His father, by the way, was still alive, living not that direction from me, in Lexington, Kentucky, whenever Hobart died. When Hobart died, Edward, Freeman, his father, was still alive, living in Lexington, Kentucky. Not a single happy story of your father, about your father. I have so many stories. I could fill up whole messages and I wouldn't be teaching the Bible anymore, just telling stories about my dad and the things I learned from my father. What I'm trying to say here is when you look for these things and don't find them, then it tells you something about Hobart Freeman's psychology. It tells you something about his background. He tells one story about Isabel Freeman, his mother. And the only way I can know these things is I've heard all of Hobart's teachings and I'm so familiar with them. He tells one story about his mother. My mother was a wingless angel. She was literally an angel sent down from heaven with no wings, is the way I believe my mother was. She was the most godly person I've ever known, the most loving, godly, caring. She would have done anything for me as her son. I'm indebted to my parents to this day. People may not picture me. I'm old school. I'm 66 years old. I do have one tattoo on me. I have a tattoo. Believe it or not, people will probably be shocked to hear that Chino Ross has a tattoo on him. I have a tattoo, and I waited And I knew I was going to get one, but I waited until the right time. And I was way on up there in my years, but it had to do with my parents. Because as I look back I look where I am in my life now, John, and all that I have and all that I've accomplished and how successful I have been. I trace it back. Of course, I give God the ultimate glory that he has been in control of my whole life from birth till now. But I give the credit to my two parents. I would not be where I am today without my dad and without my mom. I simply wouldn't be here. It was their example. It was their sacrifice. They were both hardworking, salt of the earth, middle class, college educated, insisting that their kids are going to be educated, insisting that we live a good life and a right life. That's the kind of upbringing I had. And thankfully, I didn't rebel against it. I was converted to Christianity early in life when I was 15 years old. So I never had time to get old enough to get into trouble and be a bad person. About the only thing I can think that I ever kind of did wrong as a child, at 4th of July, you have fireworks, and there was a type of firework. I don't know what you called it, but it had a string on both ends, so you could tie one onto the doorknob, tie the other onto the door casing, and when the person opened the door, it would pop. So some friends and I got together and tied a whole line of them together across the entrance to our road that we lived on. I lived on Pickett Cove Road, from the stop sign on one side of the road over to a sign on the other side. We tied it just about at windshield height, and the police were patrolling the area. And so here comes a police car, and it pushes against that long of all of these booby traps, and they just explode, pow, 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 across the windshield of that cop car. And I'm embarrassed to say I did that. I was probably 13 or 14 years old when I did that. That's as much. And we were hiding in the tall grass, in the weeds, right there beside the road. The weeds were so tall you couldn't find us. We were down there just giggling under our breath, watching those cops try to figure out what happened to their car. Yeah, that I should not have done that. That was terrible for me to do that. But it's like the only thing I did to get in trouble. But yeah, I mean, I have, to my parents, I owe you everything. That's the kind of childhood I have. And unfortunately, I don't think Dr. Freeman had that. He's got one story of Isabel Freeman, his mother. And that's when he said once he got the baptism in the Holy Spirit in 1966, he'd been praying and praying for his mom to be saved because she wasn't a Christian. And he said, I stopped praying and I just claimed John 14:14. If you ask anything in my name, I'll do it. He said, I prayed that prayer and in 15 minutes, my mom was saved. And what he means by that, because you have to hear all the tapes and you hear the other stories, that's the prayer that he prayed. But not 15 minutes after that prayer was she saved. At a later point, he was able to go and talk to his mother and share the gospel with her. And then he does tell the story that my mother got saved. And I assume that's a true story. I hope it is. And that's wonderful that it was. But no other stories about your mom sewing your clothes or picking you up at school or baking you goods to carry to school? Is there nothing good to say about your father or your mother? He has no stories about his siblings except one. Remember, he was raised in a family with all sisters. He was the youngster and he had a gaggle of girls, 5 or 6 older sisters. He tells one story that I can remember about a sister of his, a blood sister, coming to a meeting where he was teaching in Dayton, Ohio. He has no stories of his lifelong companion, Ava June Freeman. No stories about his wife, except stories where she had some ringing in her ear and she claimed her healing and the ringing went away. Then it came back. Then it went away. Then it came back. And she just had to endure by faith, and then it went away, and then it never came back. No stories about your wife where you just want to just say something. It would just come out naturally. You hear what I'm saying? It would just come out naturally. You wouldn't have to plan for it in a message. Something would just come out because of a thought you have about your wife. And you'd want to tell this story about, my wife is just the best person in the world. She's my best friend, or she cooked the best meal last night, or something that you would want to say. Nothing about his wife. And, he was a father of 3 beautiful girls. I've seen pictures of the Freeman daughters when they were young. Those were some beautiful young ladies. He's a proud papa. No stories about his daughters. No stories about his daughters, except, see, the only time he would tell a story is if it would somehow tie into his ministry. So he tells one story about his 3 daughters being in a terrible automobile wreck. And I don't remember the ages, but I think I'm pretty close on them. I think Becky was about 12, Kathy was about 16, and Pam was about 18. So basically all in their teenage years. And he has told that story on maybe a dozen tapes, but here's the context. He and June were traveling. He was preaching in a meeting somewhere. He got news of that right before he was getting ready to stand up and speak, that your daughters have been in a terrible automobile wreck. And he found out about it. He took his wife, June's hand. They went out into the alley beside the meeting. They just claimed their healing and walked back in and did his teaching. So what he wanted to show everyone was, we're not going to rush home or anything, because God's faithful. We don't need to go home. They have faith and we have faith, and we've prayed for them. And so they're healed. And so I'm going to practice what I preach rather than being worried or cancel the meeting and drive home. I'm just going to stay right here and preach. Any stories that he told another one about Kathy, who had the Hong Kong flu one time, and then God gave her a vision of a bunch of Vietnamese boys, and she was going to pray for them, and God was going to save them. And it might be some kind of like a mighty wind, Mel Tari, Indonesia kind of thing. I don't know. He would only tell a story about the girls if it involved him or he looked favorable in it. And I'll tell you one last one, John, and I've told you this one before, but to show you what I mean, no stories from childhood or mother or father or wife or daughters, unless it somehow fed the narcissism that Dr. Freeman had in him, was whenever his oldest daughter, Pam, who had married Steve Hill, I think they got married, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe in 1970. Her firstborn was a couple of years after that, and she had been in labor for 3 days. This was a long period of labor. And so everybody, she was not going to the hospital, going to have natural childbirth at home. And everybody was a little concerned and upset about it. And you can hear this, by the way, on a tape entitled Praying in Faith at the 34 minute and 16-second mark is where he tells this story. And he's told it a few other times, but he gives more details here. So they're calling him and saying, we need some help believing. So on the 3rd day, Hobart says, he's driving over to Pam and Steve's house, and on the way over there, the Lord, he said, told him just to trust his faithfulness. So when Dr. Freeman got there, he sat in the living room, and he basically takes credit for the childbirth, because he said every time someone would walk in the room like, oh, it's getting to the 2nd day now, or every time someone would walk in the room, he would say, God's word is true and God is true to his word. God's word is true and God's true. And so he basically takes credit for 3 days worth of labor that his daughter had to go through. I don't really call these proud papa stories about your children. They're always telling a story only whenever he can work himself into the narrative.
I'm choosing my words carefully here because I don't want to anger those who really are indoctrinated and can't help it. But I have family members who, as you can imagine, have completely cut us off, won't have anything to do with my children or myself or my wife. But in that one off chance where you might see them once every 5 to 10 years, whenever the children are around, they're basically the props for how wonderful life is in the family that they never go see. And they'll come up and, just brag on my children, and yet won't ever come to see them. And it's kind of the same way. They've been manipulated in the same way that you're describing with Hobart Freeman. The Stage Act has separated everything personal from the Stage Act. And so the Stage Act is everything, and the appearances are everything. Hobart Freeman, I'm certain if he were in the same situation with, my family members and my children, he would probably do the same thing, because that's how these guys think and act. And it is narcissism, like you said. But what's really sad is that narcissism trickles down to the members without them even understanding what's happening. Because, again, in the book Combating Cult Mind Control, you begin to understand that the people who are manipulated take on the identity of the cult leader. And it's not their personality. It is a cult identity that they've taken on, a cult personality. And that's what you see when you see the people, especially if you get them to thinking and talking about the cult. The cult personality rises, the authentic person inside goes down. And it's really sad. The whole thing is really sad. I could go off and talk probably 10 podcasts about just that, but we'll cut it off. We're a little bit over right now, and I will not drag everybody down. It's an uplifting thing to have escaped, and I think people, if they can take something that we've said and just think about their past and think about how wrong this close-knit, unhealthy level of closeness people were, and then think about the new people that they're around. If you go to church, think of the new church, how much healthier it is not to have that in-your-face closeness and not to have that negativity. When people start focusing on the positive instead of the negative, their life changes for better. So hopefully we have said something that will change somebody's life for the better. So thank you for doing this.
You're welcome, John. I'm sorry too to have to talk about some of this, and as you have said before, sometimes I feel sorry as I think of Dr. Freeman's life. I just have to, when I look at what he did not talk about regarding his parents, I mean, it's the silence is somewhat deafening that he probably did not have the best childhood, and not all of us do. And I understand that. Like I said, with, my tattoo, I waited until my mother, who was the last one of my parents to pass away, until she passed away. And that was, I had no need of it while one of them was still here. But when both of my parents died, that's when I went and got that, just to always remind myself to be thankful for them. But even if you haven't had a good childhood, we all have had something traumatic in our background. All of us have. And we just have to find a healthy way, a biblical way, a prayerful way, a counseling way to deal with that, so that we are not still suffering the effects from it. To whatever degree we can, we need to try to escape it.
Absolutely.